Come along with me this week whilst I make my third ever wedding cake. The wedding is on Saturday, but I start preparing at the beginning of the week. This is Tuesday, and the first thing I needed to do was check that a 14-inch board actually fits in my boot because my husband has taken the other car. There was plenty of space, so that put my mind at ease. Then I headed out to grab the ingredients from Aldi. I don't buy all my ingredients from Aldi. It's mainly the eggs, butter, cream and chocolate. I always check that eggs haven't cracked before I take them to the till. Does anyone else do that? So I picked up everything I needed. I got to the till. It doesn't look like a lot, but that was nearly £27 worth of stuff. I then had to drive over to Asda because Aldi don't sell buttermilk, which is quite annoying. I need the buttermilk for the red velvet sponge. This is going to be a 2-tier cake covered in ganache and fondant. The bottom tier is classic vanilla and strawberry, and the top tier is red velvet and white chocolate. I grabbed my printed recipes. They are all available through my standstill link if anyone's interested. So I started with the bottom tier, which is the 8-inch vanilla sponges. I'm doing 3 layers. Whilst they was cooling down, I made up some simple syrup and then put the red velvet sponges in the oven. I always like to trim the tops off, add the simple syrup, and then I double wrap in cling film and I pop them in the freezer. I do the exact same with my red velvet sponges. Look how perfect they turned out. I will be ganaching these sponges on Thursday. Tomorrow I will be preparing the boards, making up the buttercream and ganache, prepping all the flowers and printing off the ingredients list. I do as much as I possibly can ahead of time because doing it all on one day would be nearly impossible. There's probably going to be around 4 or 5 parts to this. This is day 2 of making my third ever wedding cake. Today is Wednesday and the cake is being delivered on Saturday. Yesterday I made all the sponges and froze them. Someone left a comment on part 1 saying that Tuesday is far too early to be baking sponges if the wedding's on Saturday. I think they were concerned about the sponges drying out, but that is understandable because if you're not a baker, it does sound like a long time. You will be surprised at how long sponges stay fresh. As long as they aren't exposed to any air, then they won't dry out. As long as you have double wrapped in cling film, they will stay fresh up to 7 to 10 days. So anyway, today I have prepped the boards. This is going to be a 2-tier cake and I am traveling with the cake stacked. So I want to make sure that the cake is stable, and to do that I add a central dowel that runs through both tiers. Let me know if you want a more detailed video on how to prep the boards for that. The next job is to prep the flowers. I like to do this ahead of time because I always underestimate how long it takes. I also do it because I like to play around with the flowers so that I can picture where I'm going to place them on the cake. Then I moved on to making the buttercream for the fillings. I needed vanilla and white chocolate. So I made the buttercream without adding any flavouring. I split the batch into 2, putting more into 1 for the larger cake. I added vanilla into 1 and then I grated some white chocolate and melted some. I find if you add too much melted white chocolate, then it can thicken up the buttercream and become quite solid. So I wanted it to stay nice and smooth, so that's why I grated some in. Final job was to make up the ganache. Now, I've always made ganache the same way, but I have seen a different method and I can't wait to try it. Anyway, that's it for now. I will see you in part 3. Day 3 of making my third ever wedding cake. Today is Thursday and the cake is being delivered on Saturday. It's a pretty straightforward job today. It's just stacking, filling and ganaching both tiers. The sponges have been in the freezer since Tuesday and I made all the buttercream and ganache yesterday. I leave the sponges in the cling film and let them partly defrost for around 15 to 20 minutes. The bottom tier is an 8-inch vanilla cake. So the 8-inch sponges are sat on top of an 8-inch cake drum. I'm then using some non-slip mat and an acrylic disc so I can move the cake around. If you don't have an acrylic disc, you can just use like another cake board. But if you do that, the cake board will probably get dirty and then you won't be able to reuse it. I've had so much use out of these acrylic discs, they've been great. If you're wondering why I'm not stacking and covering this cake on the baseboard, it's because the last time I did this, I did get some marks on the baseboard that I couldn't get off. So I want to keep the bottom board nice and clean because I felt like it did ruin the pictures. I don't think it was noticeable to anyone else, but it really bothered me. Oh, this is a little trick I've seen, by the way. I'm using these little felt round, I don't even know what they're called. You use them underneath furniture so they don't scrape the floor. So I stick them underneath the acrylic discs so that it's easier to pick up. Works really well when you're trying to get the cake in and out of the fridge. So now I'm on to crumb coating and adding the final layer in ganache. I'm going to be honest, I did not have the easiest time with this ganache. Sometimes it works like a dream and other times not. I think it might be because the sponges were too cold and my kitchen was cold, so it just kept setting really quick. I kept reheating and whisking it to soften it up. It wasn't much fun. I do think there are better techniques out there, and I did mention in my last video I have seen another way to do it, which I can't wait to try. Anyway, I managed to get the final layer on, but it was very patchy. I poke a bamboo stick through the centre of both cakes to release any trapped air, and then I store them in the fridge overnight in their boxes. This prevents condensation. I'll be back tomorrow with part 4. day 4 of making my 3rd ever wedding cake. Today is Friday and the cake is being delivered tomorrow. The cakes were covered in ganache yesterday and they've been sat in the fridge overnight. So this morning I pulled them out of the fridge and let them sit in the box for around half an hour whilst I roll out the fondant. I'm using the paneling method, so I measure the circumference and height of the cake and then roll out a piece of fondant that's big enough. I cut a nice straight edge along the fondant using a pizza cutter, and then I grab my small rolling pin and then roll it up. I dust the fondant with some corn flour and the rolling pin because it can get stuck. I rub a little bit of Trex on the cake so that the fondant has something to stick to. I flip the cake upside down so that I can cut off the bottom edge. After I covered both the cakes in fondant, it was time to add them to the baseboard. I peeled off the double-sided tape and then I picked up the cake. There is a hole in the cake drum, so I lined that up with the dowel and then lowered the cake on. I added all the flower decorations that I could on the bottom and top. I can't add the flowers in the middle section because I'm not stacking the cake until tomorrow. I wanted to seal up the gap along the bottom of the cake, so I made up some royal icing and added that to a piping bag. I snipped off the end to make a tiny hole and then I piped around and used my finger to blend it in. There was quite a few air bubbles on this cake for a few different reasons. I am gonna have to explain all that in the next video. Fifth and final part of making my 3rd ever wedding cake. Today is Saturday. The cake needs to be delivered by 1 p.m. I need to stack the tiers and add a few decorations. I want to fully decorate the cake at home so that the delivery is nice and easy. I just want to get there, drop the cake, take a few pictures and then run away. So I covered both of the cakes yesterday, but I didn't add any dowels. And the reason I do that is because sometimes the cake can settle overnight. So there's been times before where I've doweled the cake in the evening and all the dowels are the perfect height, they're nice and level with the fondant. And then I've come back the next day and some of the dowels are sticking up above the cake. So I used to think, oh, maybe I didn't do it right last night, but it's because the sponges can settle and shrink down a little bit overnight, especially if they've not been in the fridge. If some of the dowels are sticking up too much, when you go to add the cake on top, there'll be quite a big gap in between the tiers. 1 to 2 millimeters isn't an issue because you can seal that up with some royal icing or buttercream like I'm about to do. But if the space is any bigger than that, then it can be quite difficult to cover up. So yeah, I just find it easier to dowel and stack on the day of delivery. Anyway, I did say in my last video I would explain why there's so many air bubbles in this cake. It's because I had an absolute nightmare with the ganache. It just kept setting really quick. The crumb coat and final layer was just very lumpy and patchy, and that really shows when you add the fondant. It also doesn't help that I used quite a thin layer of fondant, so it really did show through. I did not have the time or energy to start the whole cake again, so I just had to roll with it and hope that the couple still loved the cake, which luckily they did. I packed a few things to travel with just in case we have any disasters on the way. But the only disaster I had was this cake on board sign, which I have been excited to use for the first time. However, I didn't think it through because I have tinted glass in my rear window. So I had to opt for plan B, which was to stick it in the side window, which is completely useless because no vehicles behind can see that. What an absolute waste of £12.50. So anyway, I drove to the venue, which was up the steepest hill imaginable with around 1,500 speed bumps. But we got there in one piece somehow, and this is it all set up. 3rd ever wedding cake done and dusted.